The Dutch West India Company colony in North America, New Netherland, was constantly under threat. The English were always looking for an excuse to take it all. The Native Americans, not always pleased with the conduct of the colonists, were quick to retaliate, and in the south, the Swedes had taken over a chunk of New Netherland and built Nye Sverige, New Sweden. Former West India Company director Willem Kieft had let their transgressions slide, but now the New Sweden's new governor Johan Claesson Riesing had seized the Dutch's newly built Fort Casimir. And the New Netherlands Director General Pieter Stuyvesant wasn't gonna let them get away with it. Once he got the go-ahead from the company, he'd wipe out New Sweden. I am Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 7 of the story of Nieuw-Amsterdam. How it started, how it ended, and everything in between. You can find links to my sources, the music, and ways to support the channel financially in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. West India Company Director General Pieter Stuyvesant, patiently waiting for an answer from the company, figured he'd mess with the Swedes a bit. He'd like to lure the Swedish governor Johan Riesing to Nieuw-Amsterdam under some pretext so he could put the fear of the company in him and get the governor to back off without bloodshed. Stuyvesant got his chance when a Swedish ship, the Gyllene Haj, the Golden Shark, under command of Captain Hendrik van Elswyk, headed for the South now Delaware River, mistakenly entered the Raritan River and anchored behind Staten Island. Elswyk blamed the navigation error on Anders Matthias. During a stopover in Puerto Rico, he put the first mate in irons after he tried to run away. Matthias may have held a bit of a grudge and sent the captain the wrong way. Maybe. Elswyk, unaware of any beef between New Sweden and New Netherland, sent a sloop to Manhattan to ask for a pilot to guide him back on his way. Instead of sending a pilot, Stuyvesant sent a sloop filled with soldiers. The men ushered the Gyllene Haj to Nieuw-Amsterdam, where the Director General arrested the boat's crew and imprisoned them at the guardhouse. He seized the Gyllene Haj and transferred her cargo to the company's warehouse. Stuyvesant smugly invited Governor Riesing to come over to have a little chat to arrange and settle some of the unexpected differences. He promised him a warm welcome, but told him he'd hold on to the Swedish ship and its cargo until a reciprocal restitution shall have been made. Governor Riesing didn't take the bait. He couldn't really count on the Swedish government at the moment. The great leader of Sweden, Axel Gustafsson Oxenstierna, had recently died, and a month earlier, Queen Christina, who had converted to Catholicism, had abdicated and given the crown to her cousin, Karl den Tiende and Gustav, though he was really the fourth Karl of Sweden, don't ask, who was a little too busy with trouble in his own neighborhood. Meanwhile, Stuyvesant convinced the Gyllene Haj's many Swedish emigrants to settle in Nieuw-Amsterdam. Most did, but it's possible that eventually many continued on to New Sweden anyway. In November, Director General Stuyvesant received the company's response. They were as angry as Stuyvesant could have hoped for. We hardly know whether we are more astonished at the audacious enterprise of the Swedes in taking our fort on the South River, or at the cowardly surrender of it by our commander, which is nearly insufferable. He has acted very unfaithfully, yea, treacherously. We entreat you to exert every nerve to avenge that injury, not only by restoring affairs to their former situation, but by driving the Swedes from every side of the river. We have put in commission 2 armed ships, the Koning Salomon and the Grote Christoffel. To the ships! Once they get here. And the army is properly trained. And it's spring, because things get a bit nippy in the winter here. On February 20th, 1655, Director General Stuyvesant's resurrected Council of War decreed to upgrade the defensive works and to distribute gunpowder to the citizens. On May 1st, they hired 2 drummers to improve the militia company's marching discipline. On August 13th, the man-of-war De Waag arrived and brought a letter from the company dated May 25th, 1655. Use this ship to wipe them all out. And we authorize a new land tax on the New Netherland citizens to finance the Remove New Sweden from the Equation battle plan. The company told the officers in New Netherland to hang in there, do their jobs, and keep everyone's spirits up, like all good magistrates and governors should do. And to demean themselves with wisdom and circumspection, and to set a good example to the community by being content and of good cheer. De Waag also delivered a letter from the regents of the Amsterdam orphanage. They had sent over a bunch of orphan boys and girls, to populate New Netherland, whether the kids liked it or not. Director General Stuyvesant was finally ready to head out with his companies to take back Fort Casimir and kick out the Swedes. The extensive preparations had been a closely guarded secret to guarantee the biggest surprise for the enemy. The War Council rented or commandeered additional ships, among them French privateer L'Espérance, which had just entered Nieuw-Amsterdam harbor. They hired pilots to navigate the river and stocked up on provisions and ammunition. The Swedish defenses were not even close to a match for the oncoming force. In fact, the victory was considered so easy that every man in Nieuw-Amsterdam wanted to join the expedition. It'd be a nice little break from the daily grind at home. Get out in the country, see some new sights, kill a couple of Swedes. On Sunday, September 5th, 1655, after the morning sermon, Stuyvesant, in the role of Army General, headed up 4 yachts, a galliot, a flute, and the 36-guns warship De Waag, with Vice Director Jean-Paul Jacquet and Reverend Johannes Megapolensis as chaplain, and a military force of about 700 men. On Friday morning, September 10th, 1655, with a favorable wind and tide, General Stuyvesant's fleet sailed up the Delaware River a mile beyond Fort Casimir, Trefaldiet. The general, all armored up, landed his forces on the western shore right between Fort Christina and Fort Trefaldiet. Stuyvesant divided his men into 5 companies. The general sent 50 men to seize control of the only road in the region and cut off communication between the 2 enemy forts. He ordered the remaining soldiers to build 6-foot-high ramparts near the fort. Stuyvesant sent Ensign Dirk Smith and a drummer carrying a flag of truce to the fort to deliver the terms of the siege, the direct restitution of our own property. The or else was implied. A place under siege had a few options. They could respond to the summons that they had enough supplies, guns and ammo to hold about an X number of days. Or they responded they didn't have enough and couldn't hope for a relief army anytime soon and surrendered the place. Bluffing was allowed, up to a point. Straight up lying about the ability to hold a place got you in trouble with the besieging army for being a tyrant and causing needless suffering. Lying about the ability not to hold a place got you in trouble with your own commander-in-chief for being a coward. There was a whole array of punishments. If the lie was severe enough for either party, you could be killed. But the death of an entire garrison was pretty much guaranteed if a place had to be taken by force. There were also rewards if you surrendered within the appropriate time frame. If generous, the victor might allow you to keep your weapons, your flags, and other belongings. But you had to make a call, either to accept the siege and fight to keep the place, or surrender. But before you made the call, you had the right to inspect the besiegers' equipment. After a little while, Lieutenant Sven Skute stepped out to survey the force assembled against him, then asked to be allowed to communicate with his superior in the other fort. Stuyvesant later smugly wrote, his request was firmly denied, and he left discontented. Governor Riesing sent Captain von Elswick to parley with Stuyvesant, who had come to party. He was gonna take it all. In the end, the commanders negotiated terms in diplomats' Latin at the edge of the marsh just below the fort. The general clearly had a superior force. So, did the Swedes want to fight and die needlessly, or would they return the Delaware River region to the Dutch? The next morning, September 11th, Skute accepted resistance was futile, boarded the Waag, and signed a capitulation. Stuyvesant gave generous terms. The Swedes were allowed to remove their artillery and 12 men could march out with arms and equipment. The others only kept their sidearms, and the officers kept their personal property. Captain von Elswick left Stuyvesant with a warning. Hodie me, kras tibi. Today me, tomorrow you. At noon, the Dutch, with sounding trumpets and flying banners, retook possession of Fort Casimir. The following day, Sunday, Chaplain Megapolensis preached a sermon to the troops. New Sweden Governor Riesing, having lost one fort, got his forces ready to defend Fort Christina, 2 miles upriver, about 35 miles below the current Philadelphia. The West India Company had actually decided that the Swedes held a legitimate title to that land and had adjusted its orders. They said, "You may allow the Swedes to hold the land on which Fort Christina is built, with a garden to cultivate the tobacco, because it appears that they made this purchase with the previous consent of the company, provided said Swedes will conduct themselves as good subjects of our government." The Stuyvesant was like, "Nuts to that! I'm taking it all!" His fleet went for anchor at the mouth of the Brandywine, and the general surrounded the fort on 3 sides with cannons. To the southeast lay a swamp, and began a siege. In very simple terms, he told the Swedish governor that the Dutch claimed the territory. They had discovered it, charted it, bought it from the natives, and settled it. Surrender. Riesing said, "Nee." New Sweden Governor Riesing stubbornly held down Fort Christina and fired a couple of cannons from its walls to scale his guns. General Stuyvesant ordered return fire. Several shots directly over the fort, followed by several rounds from the batteries. He summoned Riesing to surrender. "Resistance was futile. You will be assimilated." Not yet. Riesing called together a council of war. They were clearly the weaker force. 30 men against 700, limited provisions, little ammo. According to siege rules, it was inappropriate to hold out. But Riesing did anyway. First, the governor figured he'd give diplomacy a whirl. Stuyvesant had no time for that. He ordered his men to kill all the cattle, goats, swine, and poultry in the fields, plunder the houses outside of the fort, and destroy the towns. For the next 12 days, there was a lot of shooting, a lot of looting, and a lot of talking, but very few injuries on either side. Riesing held out for 2 weeks. No one was marching to the rescue, but even with his men half-starved by now, Riesing declared he would defend the fort to the last. If the place were captured, he'd plead for forgiveness with the Swedish government later. Finally, after 16 days, General Stuyvesant, who'd remained moderate, fair, dignified, and patient, was done. He got all the cannons surrounding the fort ready and sternly summoned Riesing to surrender within 24 hours or suffer the consequences of a capture by force of arms. That means death. Riesing called the entire garrison together. It was unanimously decided that defense was hopeless. They'd surrender the fort on the best possible terms. But then, in the middle of Stuyvesant's victory lap, he received a desperate plea from Nieuw-Amsterdam. A disaster had descended upon them. He was needed back home. So Stuyvesant quickly finalized the proceedings and gave the Swedes more generous terms of surrender than he otherwise would have. On September 16th, the victor and the vanquished signed the surrender agreement. The governor, his officers and men marched out, drums beating, their flags waving, and with all their weapons, possessions and paperwork to Nieuw-Amsterdam and Sweden beyond. All citizens had to either leave within a year and 6 weeks from now, or they could stay if they swore an oath of allegiance to the West India Company and the States General. The Dutch took possession of the fort, hauled down the Swedish flag, and hoisted their own. Stuyvesant then summoned all the Indian chiefs on the banks of the river for a solemn conference at the fort. The chiefs ceded to the West India Company all the lands on both sides of the river. The Director General wanted the Finns to stay and offered them deals to continue settling the wilderness. They accepted the offer and spread further inland, using their forest clearing skills to literally open the American frontier. The Finns also introduced the log cabin to the Americas. And poof! Just like that, after 17 years existing in relative peace, New Sweden was gone. The Swedes swore they'd be back. They weren't. When Old Sweden heard of the news of the loss of the colony, King Carl wanted to declare war on the Dutch. But he was already knee-deep in the Second Northern War with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So, the Swedish government sent the Dutch government a strongly worded letter instead. Riesing bitterly complained to King Carl that he and his companions had been left as sheep doomed to the knife to receive the wild barbarians. Others dramatically claimed they'd suffered great hardships from the Dutch. Stuyvesant countered constantly. You encroached on Dutch land. You knew well that you encroached on Dutch land. Then you just violently seized our fort for no reason. Now don't go crying to Daddy that we removed you encroachers. The West India Company, while overall pleased with Pegleg Pete's work, also complained that they would have preferred there'd been no treaty at all. Just wham bam thank you ma'am, the way the Swedish had taken Fort Casimir. With all business settled, Stuyvesant left Vice Director Jacquet in charge as commandant of the Zuidrivier to guard the place, and raced back to Nieuw-Amsterdam, where a war had unleashed. Director General Stuyvesant and the Indians had always been on good terms. He was tough but fair, and they respected him for it. But at midnight, September 15, 1655, 64 war canoes, with, depending on who you ask, between 600 and 1900 armed Indians, all war painted up, stealthily paddled into the water surrounding Fort Amsterdam. They disembarked at the southernmost point of Manhattan Island, just below the fort. They were Maquas, Mahicanders, the Indians of the North River, from above to below. They rushed through the streets in the town, shrieking, firing arrows and swinging axes. They weren't out to cut throats and made no attempts to kill. They just wanted to scare the crap out of the residents and plunder. The residents woke up and freaked out, but they lacked the manpower to stop the thieves from ransacking their homes. The chiefs offered no explanation for why they'd come and didn't issue any threats. They promised to withdraw to Noten Eiland, today's Governor's Island, at nightfall. Then, for no apparent reason, one of the warriors struck Ensign Hendrik Thomassen van Dijk in the chest with an arrow, killing him. Moments later, Captain Paulus Leenertsen van der Grist, the equipage master, was felled with an axe. The few soldiers left to guard Fort Amsterdam heard the cry of murder up and down the street and raced to the scene while the residents tried to make peace with the attackers. Once the soldiers arrived on the scene, a fierce battle broke out. 3 Indian warriors were killed and 5 Swanekens died, and 3 were wounded. As the Indians were driven to their canoes and paddled off, they didn't go to Noten Eiland as promised. They headed straight for Pavonia and Hoboken. Moments later, the people on Manhattan Island saw the flames arise from the Boweries. Men were killed, women and children were taken prisoner. The Nieuw-Amsterdam settlers were powerless to help. Nearly all their soldiers were in New Sweden with the Director General. The Indians then went to Staten Island. The 90 residents on the 28 farms and plantations somehow heard of the coming danger. Could have been the flames, the shooting, or a messenger from Fort Amsterdam. All fled to the stronghold where they could defend themselves. 23 were cut off by the Indians, but 67 managed to reach it. Meanwhile, all the buildings were reduced to ashes and all the crops were destroyed. The Indians hardly met any opposition on their 3-day burning and murder spree around the Bay, Long Island and Manhattan Island. In the end, 100 were killed, 150 were taken prisoner, 300 were left homeless. 600 cattle and massive amounts of wheat were destroyed. The damage was valued at over 80,000 guilders. The Long Island farmers fled to Fort Amsterdam for protection, and no one dared to venture out. Why all this? Some claim that it was because Ensign van Dijk killed an Indian woman for stealing peaches, and so they called this sudden outburst of violence the Peach War. Some claim this attack was ordered by the chief of the Minquas or Susquehannocks tribe in the South River area, who for 17 years had been hearing the Swedes' fake news about the bloodthirsty Dutch colonists. Some say it was because the Indians liked the Swedes and Stuyvesant's destruction of New Sweden made them unhappy. Some said they'd been planning something for a while and had only waited for Pegleg Pete and his soldiers to be gone to avenge something else. On September 20th, the town's magistrates ordered for planks to be added to the palisades, making the wall at least 12 feet tall to prevent het overlopen, the jumping over of the Indians. A messenger was sent to New Sweden to inform Director General Stuyvesant of the colony's ruin and begged him to return. Still, after a few days, the so-called Peach War was over. The war seemed to have claimed one notable victim, Adriaan van der Donck. His death isn't recorded, but it appears he died during one of the assaults. Stuyvesant heard about his death from a Wekuskek Indian from Yonkers who had been a good friend of van der Donck and had taken care of his cows for some time. Van der Donck's wife, Mary, survived whatever happened and joined her father, the Reverend Francis Doughty, in Virginia, where she became a medical practitioner. Adriaan van der Donck's book, Beschrijvingen van Nieuw-Nederland, Description of New Netherland, published around the time of his death, became a bestseller and went into his second edition the following year. On October 1st, Stuyvesant, fresh from his victory over New Sweden, returned to Nieuw-Amsterdam with his military force. The colonists were like, phew. The Director General was back in charge, and he really stepped up during the crisis. Stuyvesant sent soldiers to the outer settlements and called all the farmers to come to Nieuw-Amsterdam. He forced every man capable of bearing arms into military service, imposed a heavy tax to pay for the strengthening of the fortifications, and forbade any vessel from leaving the harbor. When the people about to set sail for Europe loudly protested, Stuyvesant fined them each $10 for disrespecting the established authorities and condescendingly advised them to possess their souls in patience. Then, one of the Hackensack captives, Captain Adriaan Krijnen-Post, superintendent of the colony on Staten Island, returned to Nieuw-Amsterdam. The Indians released him to negotiate peace. As it turned out, keeping many prisoners was a bit of a problem for them. Winter was coming, and they were running low on provisions. They promised to let everyone go once the Dutch paid them a specified amount of powder and ball. When Captain Post didn't return soon enough, the Indians sent another captive messenger. Then, one of the Hackensack chiefs released 14 Dutch men, women and children as a show of goodwill. Now send me the powder and ball. The Director General sent them 3 Nieuw-Amsterdam envoys with some ammunition, 2 Indian captives, and a promise to send more ammunition when other Christians were brought in. The envoys got a truce-like treatment. They were able to ransom 28 more captives and returned with a promise that others would be released soon. Stuyvesant asked what the price tag was of a bulk release of all the prisoners, or what the price per head was. The Indians had a little think and responded that they'd release 28 prisoners for 78 pounds of powder and 40 bars of lead. The director rushed over the amount plus an additional 35 pounds of powder and 10 lead bars, hoping they'd be generous. They weren't. They returned the 28 prisoners and no more. While the Highland Indians still held several New Netherland residents captive, the Long Island Indians sent a delegation to Nieuw-Amsterdam. They said they'd been friends with the Dutch for 10 years since 1645 and never did anything bad to them, not even to the value of a dog. Meanwhile, the Eastern chiefs sent a gift of wampum as a token of their friendship, but the Highland Indians remained displeased. They kept the prisoners, just in case the Dutch sought revenge. The New Netherland Council debated the best way to get him back. Warmonger Schout-Fiscaal Cornelis van Tienhoven wanted to unleash a full-scale war, but he was the only one. Everyone knew the Indians would never do a prisoner exchange and war wouldn't free anyone. The moment an assault began, the natives would simply take their prisoners and melt into the forest, never to be seen again. Director General Stuyvesant said, "The recent war is to be attributed to the rashness of a few hot-headed individuals. It becomes us to reform ourselves, to abstain from all that is wrong, and to protect our villages with proper defenses. Let us build blockhouses wherever they are needed, and not permit any armed Indian to enter the European settlements." Stuyvesant ordered the rural inhabitants living in remote areas to live together in villages before spring arrived so they could be protected after the fashion of our New England neighbors. Meanwhile, 130 Swedish immigrants, unaware that New Sweden was no more, arrived on the Mercurius, the Mercury in New Netherland. Stuyvesant forbade them to disembark. He sent a vessel and soldiers to capture the Swedish ship and bring it and all its passengers to Fort Amsterdam. After unloading the cargo, Stuyvesant sent the ship and its Swedish soldiers back to Europe. Stuyvesant, following orders from home, built a fort at Oyster Bay on the north side of Long Island, to maintain by force if necessary the integrity of the Dutch province, the boundaries of which have just been formally confirmed by the States General. Now that everyone realized North America had potential, it was high time they caught up with England's expansion before New England swallowed them whole. But where to get new settlers? Everyone in the Republic was cozy and comfy, and few were willing to venture into the wilderness. But around this time in Old Amsterdam, the refuge for the religiously persecuted of all nations, a very large group of religious refugees arrived. They were the Waldenses from Piedmont, Italy, followers of a pre-Reformation church movement. The Roman Catholic Church, who had recently dusted off their Heretics Destruction Handbook, pressured the Duke of Savoy, Charles-Emmanuel, to persecute this religious group. The Duke ignited the Savoyard-Waldensian Wars, which ended up killing some 7,000 Waldensian civilians. Amsterdam granted the refugees asylum, supported them with money, and decided to house them in a yet-to-be-established new colony in the former New Sweden area. The city paid the West India Company 700 guilders to buy all the land on the west side of the South River from Christina Kill to Bombay Hook, today Newcastle, Delaware. They called this region Nieuw-Amstel. Colonists were given free passage, large riverside farms, and a year's supply of food and clothes. The moment the colony reached 200 souls, they could organize a church. On Christmas Day, 1656, 3 ships sailed from Texel carrying 160 immigrants. A wintry storm soon separated them. At midnight, the flagship, the Prins Maurits, carrying 125 passengers, 76 of whom were women and children, ran aground on the south coast of Long Island, near present-day Islip. At dawn, the passengers and crew braved breakers and sheets of floating ice and reached the shore. But the land was a bleak, barren, treeless waste, without weeds, grass, or timber of any sort to make a fire. It was bitterly cold, and the immigrants, huddled together, had no food or shelter, and would soon freeze or starve, whichever came first. Then several Indians approached across the plains and helped them in every way. First, they sent fast messengers to New Amsterdam. Then they dragged the sails on land to make shelters and brought food to save the castaways from absolute starvation. Director General Stuyvesant immediately headed out with 9 or 10 light ships and supplies. Nearly all the cargo was saved, and the passengers were transported to New Amsterdam. The Gouden Bever, the Golden Beaver, chartered at New Amsterdam, brought them all to the south now Delaware River. The fleet's 2 other vessels carrying soldiers and a few settlers arrived soon after. Willem Kiefs and Pieter Stuyvesant's longtime henchman Cornelis van Tienhoven had fled from The Hague and returned to Manhattan with his girlfriend. He became the joke of the town, though I doubt his wife was laughing. On his return, Director General Stuyvesant made van Tienhoven schout-fiscaal, but the man became a liability, especially when it appeared he was cooking the books, aka defrauding the company, the sinnest a company man could sin. In 1656, Cornelis van Tienhoven vanished, but his hat and cane were found floating near the shore. Stuyvesant declared the death a drowning, good riddance, but he could have run off. His brother, caught in a fraud, disappeared around the same time and turned up in Barbados later. In 1655, Director General Stuyvesant had decided something had to be done about the fire hazard that was New Amsterdam, a cluster of wooden houses with thatched roofs and wooden chimneys. He had already issued an order forbidding the future construction of wooden chimneys between the fort and the fresh river. But in 1657, he ordered the removal of all wooden chimneys, thatched roofs, haystacks, hen houses, and hog pens within the town wall. Stuyvesant worked hard to make New Amsterdam a better place to live. On March 4, 1658, the city council passed the director's 8-point ordinance. Among other things, a ferry service to Long Island was launched. A village called Nieuw Haarlem, today's Harlem, was established at the northern end of Manhattan Island to serve as an early warning post in case of Indian or English troubles, but also as a place for the further amusement and development of the city of New Amsterdam, making it a tourist destination with taverns and inns and a lot of entertainment options. The Director General also ordered the construction of a good road toward New Haarlem through the forest, so that it may be made easy to come hither and return to that village on horseback or in a wagon. After the Anglo-Dutch War, the fallen Admiral Maarten Harpertszoon Tromp had to be replaced. During the stadholderless period, the so-called Orangists were eager to increase the power of Prince Willem III of Orange-Nassau, still a kid. But the States General wanted to avoid orange-minded admirals like the plague, so Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt strongly urged the politically neutral Michiel Adriaanszoon de Ruyter to replace Tromp as commander-in-chief. But de Ruyter was like, I don't know, that was a big job, and he'd been retired until the war called him back into action. Also, he didn't want to pass over older and higher-ranking admirals such as Johan Evertsen and Witte de With. But Johan de With considered Johan Evertsen Team Orange and Witte de With a loose cannon. The States General ended up appointing Army Commander Jacob van Wassenaar Opdam, who'd been the government's observer of Slands Vloot at the Battle of Scheveningen as Lieutenant Admiral. The Captain Admiral title was reserved for stadholders. On March 2, 1654, de Ruyter did become Vice Admiral at the Admiralty of Amsterdam, and he moved his family there. Meanwhile, the Dutch created the New Navy by adding some 60 heavier ships. This new navy would multitask. It protected the shipping routes against privateers and pirates, mainly in the Mediterranean, for instance with a Mediterranean Sea expedition against Algiers privateers. They had to prevent King Carl of Sweden from bringing the entire Baltic Sea under his control, for instance by relieving the town of Danzig from a Swedish siege. And lastly, the Dutch kept kicking the Portuguese out of their colonies the world over, and boy, did the Portuguese not take that well. By 1657, the Republic had recovered its fleet from the damage inflicted by the Anglo-Dutch War and was right back at a full-scale war with Portugal, with blockades, sugar fleet interceptions, colony captures in the East Indies, the whole shebang. The French and the English were like, dudes, chill. At last, negotiations to end the on-again, off-again Dutch-Portuguese War started in July 1658, but talks would last another 3 years. New Netherland was experiencing some problems regarding the Dutch Indian trade. For one, the French Canadians were outbidding the Dutch, which decreased the profit margins. Second, because of overhunting, the Indians had to go ever deeper inland to find beavers, which slowed down trade. But third, foreign traders simply snuck past Nieuw-Amsterdam, went upriver, and stole company business. They'd hang around in Nieuw-Amsterdam, but not being residents, they contributed nothing of their profits to the city government for defense or improvements. Nieuw-Amsterdam's mayors and schepenen wanted to put a stop to this unfair practice. They petitioned the Director General and Company Council to withdraw the free trade privilege from outsiders. If anyone wanted to buy and sell stuff, they should have a warehouse and pay taxes like everyone else. In February 1657, Stuyvesant and his council created Great and Small Citizenships, the only ones allowed to trade. A great citizenship was offered to former and current members of the government, mayors, schepenen, reverends, military officers and their descendants. The fee was 50 guilders and they would have a say in government and policy. Those born in the colony, residents of 1 year and 6 weeks, those married to residents and store owners could buy a small citizenship for 20 guilders. But few residents were willing to cough up the 50 guilders to reach the rank of great citizens. Only those who held office, some 200, paid for it. Most were happy to just get the small citizenship for 20 guilders, which basically made them minor shareholders in the company. There was even a payment plan to pay the fee in installments. The system made New Netherland more egalitarian than New England, where the number of town citizens never exceeded 20% of the population. When the citizens complained about being limited to trading only with the Republic, the company permitted trade with France, Spain, Italy and the West Indies on payment of duties. Now we're cooking with gas. Prosperity was on the rise. Most Nieuw-Amsterdam residents were merchants or had trade side hustles, which created opportunities for upward mobility. A young man from modest backgrounds could accumulate significant wealth, a precursor to the American dream. But there was a group who didn't belong to the merchant class. Not at first, anyway. It was difficult to find men to work in the colony, but Dutch traders brought in Africans to do the job. And by Africans, we mean enslaved people. They were initially shipped in from other colonies in the West Indies, but this was a small-scale operation, not like the slave-driven businesses in the sugar fields of Brazil and the Caribbean. Stuyvesant was not only Director General of New Netherland, but also Governor of the Caribbean islands Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, Saba, Sint Maarten and Sint Eustatius. He directed his vice-director on Curaçao, Matthias Beck, to convert the island into a processing plant for tens of thousands of chained, ill and weakened West Africans. But in 1654, the first ship that came directly from Africa arrived in Nieuw-Amsterdam. While citizens of New Netherland were allowed to join the slave trade, no one did. However, the situation in New Netherland didn't compare to the hardcore slavery scene in the 1800s in the American South. At any one time, New Netherland had a few dozen enslaved people who mostly worked as servants. The black people seem to have done not too badly at the hands of the Dutch citizens, considering, and were content, considering. They had rights. They could petition to be freed after years of services. This petition was generally granted. As freedmen, they were equal to other citizens except that they had to pay a yearly tribute to the company. Enslaved people also had some other legal rights. Records show slaves appearing in court filing lawsuits against the Europeans. Several Africans owned property, and Stuyvesant himself declared that their ownership was to be looked on as true and free ownership with such privileges as all tracts of land are bestowed on the inhabitants of this province. Stuyvesant was a lot less considerate of another group of New Netherland residents. Religion wasn't as big a deal in New Netherland as it was in New England. During the 80 Years' War with the Spanish Empire over, among other things, religious persecution, the Dutch had gained freedom of conscience. While most rulers believed such diversity weakened a nation, the Dutch were a lot more tolerant. And by tolerant we mean willing to put up with differences. In New Netherland, like in the Republic, only the Calvinists were allowed the public exercise of religion. However, like in the Republic, anyone could worship whatever religion they wanted in the privacy of their own homes. Naturally, some of these homes housed ever larger assemblies and became churches in their own right. The West India Company wanted New Netherland to be a place where everyone, regardless of their beliefs, could just get along. Well, Director Stuyvesant didn't get the memo. Much like the New England leaders, the strict Calvinist was less than thrilled to see New Netherland becoming a patchwork of ethnicities. Stuyvesant wasn't a religious bigot per se, but he felt subjects should follow the rules and listen to the people in charge. He had no patience for rebels and punished civil disobedience severely, even if said rebellion came in the shape of religion. Stuyvesant constantly clashed with New Amsterdam residents and with the company, who had to tell him off more than a few times. Respect the toleration, man. The West India Company wrote Stuyvesant, "It is our intention to permit everyone to have freedom within his own dwelling to serve God in such manner as his religion requires, but without authorizing any public meetings or conventicles." An example. The Lutherans in the Republic sent Reverend Johannes Ernestus Goedwasser to New Amsterdam to organize a church. I don't think I mentioned it yet, but the Lutherans and Calvinists hated each other nearly as much as they each hated the Roman Catholics. The New Amsterdam Calvinist clergy told the Director General to ban Goedwasser from preaching anywhere, also in private. Now this Lutheran parson is a man of a godless and scandalous life, a rolling, rollicking, unseemly carl who is more inclined to look into the wine can than to pore over the Bible, and would rather drink a can of brandy for 2 hours than preach one. So Stuyvesant cited his oath to tolerate no other religion openly than the Reformed and ordered Goedwasser to return to the Republic. Lutherans could attend the regular Dutch church instead. What was good enough for the other residents was good enough for them. He then issued a proclamation forbidding anyone from holding a non-reformed religious meeting at the penalty of £100. Any attendee was fined 25 guilders. The director strictly enforced this new law, and those who disobeyed paid the price, fines or jail time. So, the Lutherans sent complaints to the company, who told Stuyvesant off. His acts were bad for business and unchristian. Law-abiding Lutherans should be allowed to worship freely. Another example. At Flushing, William Wickendham, a Baptist cobbler from Rhode Island, dared to preach, and even went with the people into the river and dipped them. He was fined 1,000 guilders and banished. The government forgave the debt since he was so poor, but they kicked him out of New Netherland. Yet another example. In 1654, 23 Jews, some of whom had fled the fall of Dutch Brazil, showed up seeking asylum. Stuyvesant was not a fan, and that's an understatement. He barred one from buying land for important reasons. and wouldn't even let them stand guard with the citizens' militia because of the aversion and disaffection of this militia to be fellow soldiers of the aforesaid Jewish nation. If they didn't like it, he told them, consent is hereby given to them to depart whenever and wherever it may please them. The Jewish leaders used their knowledge of Dutch law to appeal to the Republic. Amsterdam's Jewish community used their political influence and won. Stuyvesant's bosses were like, what part of the each person shall remain free in his religion law do you not understand? Besides, who did he think was funding a big chunk of the West India Company? So back off! Okay, so Lutherans, Baptists, and Jews, sure. But he drew the line at English Quakers. The Religious Society of Friends was a Protestant faction from England. They're more commonly called Quakers because its founder, George Fox, once told a judge to quake before the authority of God. Fox encouraged his brethren to have direct relations with God through Jesus Christ and to read and study the Bible. He also felt all believers could be preachers. This didn't go over well in England. So, the Quakers fled from Old England to New England, and when the Puritans kicked them out for not being Puritan, they ended up in New Netherland. Director General Stuyvesant had already arrested, fined, then banished Henry Townsend, a Quaker who held meetings at his house. On the 6th of August 1657, a ship from Barbados arrived at Nieuw-Amsterdam with several Quakers on board. They were on their way to Rhode Island, where, according to Reverend Megapolensis, all kinds of scum dwell, for it is nothing else than a sink for New England. The Quakers had the audacity to preach in the streets of Long Island. Stuyvesant sent over Reverend Francis Doughty to talk some sense into them, but they didn't listen and continued their preaching. The director issued a decree forbidding Flushing, from supporting them. The town's 29 adult men, all English, followed the Dutch legal code and signed a remonstrance to Stuyvesant drawn up by the town clerk, Edward Hart. It said, "We are commanded by the law of God to do good unto all men. The law of love, peace, and liberty, extending in the state to Jews, Turks, and Egyptians, forms the glory of Holland. So love, peace, and liberty, extending to all in Christ Jesus, condemn hatred, war, and bondage." The so-called Flushing Remonstrance is considered one of the foundational documents of American liberty, a precursor of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which guarantees that the government shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The sheriff of Flushing, Tobias Feek, presented the remonstrance to the Director General in Nieuw-Amsterdam, who was like, "You disrespectin' me?" An enraged Stuyvesant had Feek arrested and imprisoned, and had Hart and two magistrates, Edward Farrington and William Noble, brought before him. No one wanted to be near the Director General once his wrath was inflamed. Farrington and Noble immediately recanted, but Hart and Feek held their ground. Both men were jailed and endured a month of solitary confinement on only bread and water. Hart's friends and family appealed to Stuyvesant, who then released and banished the elderly clerk. Feek held out for a few more weeks, but eventually recanted, and he received a pardon, but was fined and banned from public service. The town was also punished. No more meetings unless the Director General said so. A new 7-member committee, none of whom were settlers, would now handle local issues. Don't like it? Sell your property and get out of town. Stuyvesant, nothing if not thorough, drew up a paper for those who stayed to sign. If any meetings or conventicles of Quakers shall be held in this town of Rustdorp that we know of, we will give information to the authorities set up by the Director General, and we will also give the authorities of the town such assistance against any such person as needs may require. Those who didn't sign were punished by having to house soldiers. Stuyvesant had 2 magistrates spy on them, and stationed several soldiers in the village to suppress any meetings. Well, the West India Company had a thing or two to say about Stuyvesant's conduct. One does not populate a colony by sending people away. Stuyvesant argued he wasn't infringing on their religious freedom, only their right to worship outside of family prayer. The Director General wouldn't back down until he went toe-to-toe with John Bown, a plain English farmer in Flushing who had attended a Quaker meeting. He dug their vibe, joined them, and even allowed them to hang out at his house. Stuyvesant arrested the man, fined him 25 guilders and threatened him with banishment. The next week, a new proclamation was issued saying, "The public exercise of any religion but the Reformed in houses, barns, ships, woods or fields will be punished by a fine of 50 guilders, double for the second offense and for the third quadruple, with arbitrary correction." John Bawl was either unable or unwilling to pay his fine and was imprisoned at Nieuw-Amsterdam for 3 months and then banished to the Republic, though he was of English descent and spoke no Dutch. Stuyvesant wrote to the company, "The contumacious prisoner has been banished as a terror to others who, if not discouraged by this example, will be dealt with still more severely." After several months in Europe, Bawl petitioned to the directors of the West India Company. After a month of deliberation, the company agreed to support Bawl and advised Stuyvesant by a letter to cut it out with the religious persecution in the colony already. They ordered Stuyvesant to let everyone remain free as long as he is modest, moderate, his political conduct irreproachable, and as long as he does not offend others or oppose the government. This was the time-honored custom of the magistrates of old Amsterdam. Tread thus in their steps, and we doubt not you will be blessed. Stuyvesant finally backed down and obeyed this ruling, and nearly every New Netherlander rejoiced. 2 years later, when John Bawl returned to New Netherland, it was said that the director received him as though he were ashamed of what he had done. The West India Company was always looking for more land and more settlers. Explorers had ventured pretty far out beyond Fort Orange and the Mohawk River. However, except for a few huts near Cohoes Falls, there were no Dutch settlements there. The beavers and wild deer in the region had been hunted to near extinction, and the Indians were eager to sell the fertile Mohawk Valley lands to New Netherland colonists. Meanwhile, Staten Island hadn't recovered from the 1655 massacre and lay wasting away, so the company tried to encourage former and new settlers to go there. Stuyvesant bought all the territory around current Burgher, New Jersey, from the Esopus Indians to promote the settlement of the west side of the North, now Hudson River. The settlement thrived, but farmers couldn't farm if they lived in villages, and going against the Director General's orders, they built farms next to their grain fields. And, stupidly, the 70 colonists at Esopus village also paid the Indians in brandy for the pelts. The intoxicated Indians often committed crimes. Once a settler was killed, at another time the house and outbuildings of another settler were burned. The Dutch retaliated by destroying the cornfields of the Indians, hoping this would keep them at a distance. Well, that did nothing but piss off the Indians, who grew more hostile every day. The alarmed colonists wrote to Stuyvesant saying, "We pray you to send 40 or 50 soldiers to save Esopus, which, if well settled, might supply the whole of New Netherland with provisions." Stuyvesant ordered the construction of a fort at Esopus, sent extra ammo, and went up the river with 50 soldiers to personally assess the people's needs. Wait, why aren't you all in the village as ordered? Hey, have you tried harvesting from afar? Newsflash, buddy, that doesn't work. Also, no one could agree on where to put the damn village. Alright, no soldiers for you then. If you regroup in a village, I'll stay to oversee the construction of a palisade. Meanwhile, the Director General sent messengers to all the chiefs in the area to come meet the Grand Sachem from Manhattan. 60 plumed Esopus warriors and a few women and children gathered under a large tree to have a little chat with Director General Stuyvesant and his interpreter. One chief gave a long speech to start off the talks. He rattled off a long list of all the crap the Indians had to put up with from the Swanakins. The Director General listened patiently, then explained that all this had happened before his time. Had anything happened since he became the big boss? We never set foot on land we didn't pay for and will always offer you compensation. So, what's up with all the murdering and burning and threatening? There was a long pause as the chiefs considered their response. Then one of them got up and said, "You Swanakins have sold our children drink. We cannot then control them or prevent them from fighting. This murder has not been committed by any of our tribe, but by a Minisink, who now skulks among the Haverstraws. 'Twas he who fired the 2 houses and then fled. We have no malice. We do not wish to fight, but we cannot control our young men after you have sold them drink." Fair point. However, the touchy Director General unleashed. "If any of your young savages want to fight, let them come on. I will place man against man, nay, I will place 20 against 40 of your hotheads. It is not manly to threaten farmers and women and children who are not warriors. If this be not stopped, I shall be compelled to retaliate on old and young, women and children. I expect of you that you will repair all damages and seize the murderer if he come among you. The Dutch are now to live together in one spot. It is desirable that you should sell us the whole of the Esopus land and move farther into the interior. It is not well for you to reside so near the Swanekens. Their cattle may eat your corn and thus cause fresh disturbance." The meeting ended with both sides expressing friendship, while the Indians promised to take the Director General's suggestions into careful consideration. The settlers agreed to live in a village, but Papa Stuyvesant should pick the site. The Director General chose a spot at the bend of a creek, so they'd be surrounded by water at 3 sides. This, combined with the 210 yards of palisades, would leave them well protected. Everyone got to work. Then, a group of 50 Indian warriors in snazzy attire showed up. Were they on the warpath? The soldiers took up a position, weapons at the ready. One of them came forward and said, "In token of our goodwill, and that we have laid aside all malice, we request the Grand Sachem to accept as a free present the land on which he has commenced his settlement. We give it to grease his feet, as he has undertaken so long and painful a journey to visit us." 3 weeks later, the defenses were done and buildings went up inside the enclosure. They built a strong guardhouse in the northeast corner of the village, a bridge across the creek, and temporary quarters for the soldiers. After a mere month, the work was completed. The Director General left 24 soldiers behind to guard the village and returned to Manhattan. In 1658, the little settlement of Nieuw-Amstel had about 100 houses and some 500 inhabitants. They were Waldenses, leftover Swedes, and immigrants from a bunch of other nationalities. However, they behaved like they were their own little independent place, and, well, Director General Stuyvesant couldn't abide. So, he went over for a little visit and had them take the oath of allegiance to the company and the States General. Stuyvesant noticed that the English residents in Nieuw-Amstel who had taken the oath remained openly sympathetic to England and the English colonies. The WIC directors wrote to Stuyvesant with this helpful suggestion to disentangle himself in the best manner possible from the Englishmen whom he had allowed to settle at Nieuw-Amstel, and at all events not to admit any English besides them in that vicinity, much less to allure them by any means whatever. There were plenty of indications that the English were thinking about moving up from Virginia into the picturesque Delaware region of New Netherland. The company directors advised Stuyvesant to quickly buy the tract of land from the Indians stretching from Cape Henlopen to Bombay Hook and its 70-mile frontage along the Delaware Bay. They wrote, "You will perceive that speed is required, if for nothing else, that we may prevent other nations, and principally our English neighbors, as we really apprehend that this identical spot has attracted their notice. When we reflect upon the insufferable proceedings of that nation, not only by intruding themselves upon our possessions about the north, to which our title is indisputable, and when we consider the bold arrogance and faithlessness of those who are residing within our jurisdiction, we cannot expect any good from that quarter." A group from Massachusetts, who had traveled up the North River, discovered an area near the Wappinger Kill, a few miles south of present-day Poughkeepsie, that they deemed more stunning than any place they had visited in New England. Perfect for a settlement. Stuyvesant told the company to send out at once as many Polish, Lithuanian, Prussian, Dutch, and Flemish peasants as possible to form a colony there. Melting pot for the win, except for the English. Boo, the English. The Dutch truly were gluttons for punishment. Despite all their experiences, warnings, and even orders, they kept giving the native population brandy. At the Esopus settlement one night in August 1659, Captain Thomas Chambers hired 8 Indians to help him husk corn. After a day's work, he gave them brandy. Because, of course. The Indians had a little party, with the usual howling, shrieking, firing of muskets, but not causing any trouble. However, the garrison stationed at the blockhouse was like, "What is happening?" The sergeant of the guard headed out with a few soldiers to check what the ruckus was all about. He returned to report that it was nothing, just a bunch of drunk Indians. However, one soldier, Jansen Stott, defying orders from Commander Ensign Dirk Smit, decided to put a stop to it. He hid in some bushes and fired at the inebriated but innocent men. One Indian was killed outright. Others were severely wounded. The soldier raced back to the fort. Smit felt he no longer had control of his soldiers and planned to leave for Nieuw-Amsterdam. This move scared the Esopus residents to death. What the soldier had done would undoubtedly lead to retaliations, and they quickly rented all the boats to prevent the soldiers from bailing. Ensign Smit sent an express messenger to tell Director General Stuyvesant to drop everything and come at once. The soldiers saw the messenger off, headed back to the blockhouse, and walked straight into a Native American trap. The Indians took 13 of them prisoner. War, horrible war, was now declared. 500 Indians war-whooped their way into the area, killed cattle and horses, and burned every house, barn, and corn stack they came across. They carried off men, women, and children and held them as hostages. Then they besieged the fort and surrounded it so tightly that no one could escape. When the Indians failed to set fire to the fort, they burned 10 of their prisoners at the stake. The news of the new war reached Manhattan and everyone panicked. New Netherland farmers eyed every Indian with suspicion. Some, fearing an assault, abandoned their homes, grain, and cattle, took their families and fled to Fort Amsterdam. Many villages on Long Island were once again utterly deserted. Director General Stuyvesant was ill, but he pulled himself together and visited all the villages in the area. Please, everyone, fortify and defend your villages. Then the Director General summoned the council. I need an army. Director General Pieter Stuyvesant summoned the mayor, schepenen, and the militia officers of Nieuw-Amsterdam to a meeting. He needed an army, but only a few residents were willing to join voluntarily. The council was like, how about a draft? The Director General was like, ain't nobody got time for that. The war was already in its 9th day and action was needed now. He was overruled. Several campaigns in the town and villages in the area only yielded a handful of volunteers. The citizens were scared, and made each other scared. They'd defend their own homes if they had to, but no one wanted to risk their lives in the wilderness in a war with the Indians. Stuyvesant only had 40 volunteers, with perhaps another 20 or 30 from the English villages. He paraded about town with his 3 companies in full gear to inspire the crowds to volunteer. He appealed to the residents' sense of honor and duty. Wouldn't they want help if they were in this situation? They could get paid. Another 24 or 25 persons stepped forward. Still not enough. So, the Director General drew lots. The 100 draftees had to be ready to move out the next Sunday or be fined 50 guilders. Cowards could appoint a substitute. Stuyvesant ended up with a force of some 180 men, 100 drafted, 65 volunteers, including 25 Englishmen, and 20 friendly Indians from Long Island. On Sunday evening, October 10, 1659, after the second sermon, the Director General embarked everyone for the rescue mission to Esopus. He landed to find the Indian siege over. The Director General's arrival probably scared them off. Stuyvesant left enough men to defend the village and returned to Manhattan with the rest. The Dutch had lost 1 man during the siege, and 5 or 6 were wounded. Flaming arrows had ignited a house and a bunch of corn stacks within the palisade. As the troops were re-embarking, Stuyvesant blushed to mention an embarrassing moment. Not everyone could board at once. Those left behind freaked out at the sound of a dog barking. Some fired shots and panic spread. Some residents were so spooked, many of them threw themselves into the water before they had seen an enemy. The Mohawk and the settlers in the Fort Orange area at modern-day Albany were good neighbors and friends. The lucrative trade benefited both parties, and everyone was perfectly harmless. When the Mohawk heard of the Esopus Indians, they declared they would not take part in the war. Yes, they were furious, but acknowledged they had no cause to fight with their friends. Those at Fort Orange sent 25 people over to the Indian settlement at Caughnawaga and had a meeting with the many chiefs in the area. They lit the council fire and smoked the calumet of peace. One of the Dutch delegation addressed the assembly. Brothers, 16 years have now passed away since friendship and fraternity were first established between you and the Hollanders. Since then, we have been bound to each other by an iron chain. That chain has never been broken by us or by you. We hope that the Mohawk will remain our brothers for all time. They presented the chiefs with several bundles of sowant, 70 pounds of powder, 100 pounds of lead, 15 axes, and 2 beavers' worth of knives. The Mohawk chiefs were mighty pleased with the presents, but they were mad. Hadn't they told them not to sell brandy to the Indians? So, you want us to take away the kegs of brandy from the Indians? Yes, please take the kegs away from the Indians. The authorities at Fort Orange then asked the Mohawk to help get an armistice with the Esopus Indians and help them get their captives back. Several chiefs accepted this mission of mercy and visited Esopus as mediators. They were partially successful. The tribe agreed to an armistice and 2 captives were released, but they kept the children. With war still lingering in the air, Director Stuyvesant wrote to the company for help. If they didn't send help, everyone will move out and the colony will be lost. The company directors told them to get the Mohawks to fight the Esopus, but Stuyvesant feared that their involvement would be highly counterproductive. And what would the other tribes think? No, they had to hold out on their own as long as possible. Meanwhile, at Esopus, Ensign Dirk Smit and his 40 men had defeated 2 bands of Indians, one of 50 warriors, one of 100. Smit captured 12 warriors and sent them to Fort Amsterdam. In the meantime, Stuyvesant renewed alliance treaties with the Indian tribes on Long Island, Staten Island, and at Hackensack, Haverstraw, and Wecquaesgeek. The Long Island Indians consented to send some of their children to Fort Amsterdam to get an education. On May 20th, 1660, Ensign Smit moved out with 75 men and went several miles up the Esopus Creek where the Indians were planting corn. The dogs sounded the alarm and the Indians fled, except for one, the oldest and best of their chiefs, Prewmaker, who was either too proud or too ill to move. According to the soldiers, he greeted the Dutch warriors with disdain, aimed his gun at them and said, "What are you doing here, you dogs?" They easily disarmed him, but what to do with the old man? Ensign Smit wrote, "As it was a considerable distance to carry him, we struck him down with his own axe." The Esopus Indians were not doing well. They'd been driven from their homes, and with the cornfields destroyed, their women and children were starving, and none of the upper Hudson Indian tribes would help them. It was said they did nothing now but bawl for peace. Peace. It would have been so easy. All Director General Stuyvesant had to do was say, "We were wrong. Sorry." It's not that hard. Well, it was for Stuyvesant. He believed the Indians had deliberately committed a series of murders and burnings without any provocation. Dude. When the Esopus Indian chiefs got a whiff of how enraged the Grand Sachem of the Dutch really was, they didn't dare venture anywhere near New Amsterdam. Instead, they sent 3 Mohegan chiefs as their mediators to make a peace offering. They'd end hostilities and relinquish the Esopus territory to the Dutch as long as their captured people were released. Stuyvesant said no. No peace until their own chiefs came to New Amsterdam to ask them nicely. Dude. To show them he meant business, Stuyvesant sent the 12 captured Esopus Indians to Curaçao to become lifelong slaves in the company's service. Big mistake. Huge. On July 11, 1660, Director General Stuyvesant left New Amsterdam for Esopus and sent messengers to summon the Esopus chiefs to come before him. But they knew Stuyvesant had sent away their warriors as slaves to the West Indies, and they were afraid to go. After waiting several days, the Director General sent envoys to the chiefs of other tribes, urging them, and I quote, to bring the Esopus savages to terms. 4 Esopus chiefs, accompanied by delegates from other tribes, finally dared to come to the village gate to take part in a grand council. Instead of imploring peace themselves, the Esopus had a Mohawk and Mingwa chief made the proposition on their behalf. Director General Stuyvesant agreed to peace on the condition that the Mohawk and the Mingwa would guarantee the Esopus upheld the treaty. The Indians had no choice but to accept Stuyvesant's harsh terms. All the lands of the Esopus were surrendered to the Dutch, driving the Indians from their homes. The starving Indians would receive 800 schepels of corn as ransom for the captive Christians. No liquors were to be drank near the houses of the Dutch. No armed Indians were allowed to approach a Dutch plantation. Both sides were to hand over murderers and compensate each other for damages. The Esopus Indians effectively lost their independence because if they broke the treaty, the mediating tribes would assist the Dutch in punishing them. The Indian warriors sent as slaves to the West Indies were not returned. In a formal speech, Stuyvesant told the Esopus chiefs to live with the Dutch as brothers. And then, turning to the Dutch, he said, "And you lot, stop irritating them and treat them justly." After this, Director General Stuyvesant headed for Fort Orange to hold another grand council with the chiefs of all the tribes in those regions. It was peace again in New Netherland. But the Italians of the Americas do not forget, and they didn't forget about their warrior brothers who had been shipped off to Curaçao. They quietly plotted their revenge.